like we were talking about at the beginning with ultras, how can you speed up your slowest mile? So in these downhill halves, a lot of people are potentially even walking by the end because their legs are shot. So you've got to try to minimize how slow those last 2 or 3 miles are. Right. So the super shoes help, a little bit of downhill running, the pacing early on and how difficult that feels. But there's still a little bit of unknown, which is what makes it exciting because you don't know exactly how it'll be because it's a bit different to things you've done in the past.
I saw you posted that half marathon. So that was one of the REVEL races, right?
Yes. So they just do a whole load of races where it's near a big city with a big mountain nearby and a downhill course on roads.
Cool. Yeah, they've been a sponsor of this podcast in the past. And my friend Phil Dumonte is the CEO over at REVEL, and they're doing some really, really cool things. Well, Brooksy operates REVEL, and they've got some really cool innovations on the timing side of things, the race timing, which is a piece of the industry that hasn't been innovated on in 30 years, as well as helping people run some really fast times. But I think those races are really challenging if you don't have the quads for them, right? So how did you train for? You talk about doing something different. That's not just a normal half marathon. That's a downhill half marathon. How did you think about something like that?
Well, that's the whole point. It's a new challenge. So you have to think through, what does this involve? Yes, in theory, it's faster, but only if you do the right thing. So it's a new way of saying, okay, well, here's the problem. What do I need from my previous experience, physically, mentally? What do I need to do in training to be able to optimize for this? And the thing I've learned, and this is also backed by the general science of downhill improvements, is you don't need a huge amount of downhill running, particularly for non-technical, just running on a road. But you need a few sessions where you're having reasonably fast running for longer periods. So I just looked and said, okay, well, the race involves, in this case, 3,000 feet of downhill. I was actually meant to be doing the marathon, but they canceled it because of ice on the road. So I instead at 3:30 in the morning and switching my mindset to, I'm doing a half now. Okay. But yeah, 3,000 feet of downhill in a half. So the kind of thing I was trying to do is in Bend, we have a mountain up here called Mount Bachelor. There is a 10-mile section going up to that is a similar kind of grade, not quite as much, but it's 2,000 feet, fairly steady in 10 miles. So I'd run up that and then run back down fairly fast. Did that about 2 or 3 times in the month or two before. So that was one of the specific things. But other than that, it was fairly normal marathon training. But it's trying to work out, because I've done 7 of their races now at REVEL, mainly marathons. So it's trying to work out, what have I learned from the previous times? What is most useful? How do the super shoes help? And by the way, they definitely do. Not just because they make you run faster, but also maybe absorbing a bit more of that pounding for those downhills. So you've got to get yourself physically ready. You've got to think about the tactics that are a little bit different. So if you're doing a flat half marathon or marathon, you know a certain effort level corresponding to heart rate, etc., is going to be what's sustainable. And so you've got an idea how that feels. When you're doing a downhill one, you have to do a slightly easier effort than that because you're causing more muscle damage. So you're thinking, what's the weakest factor? What is going to be the thing that slows me down? Like we were talking about at the beginning with ultras, how can you speed up your slowest mile? So in these downhill halves, a lot of people are potentially even walking by the end because their legs are shot. So you've got to try to minimize how slow those last 2 or 3 miles are. Right. So the super shoes help, a little bit of downhill running, the pacing early on and how difficult that feels. But there's still a little bit of unknown, which is what makes it exciting because you don't know exactly how it'll be because it's a bit different to things you've done in the past.
You were a former and regular guest on one of my favorite podcasts back in the day, The Science of Ultra. And you and David and a few others, Chrissy and Sean, talked about the science of the sport. And while this podcast is more on the mental side of the sport, I do like getting into some of the tangible and tactical stuff on occasion. And so to dive a little bit further into it, talk to me about the repeated bout effect or looking at how to think about downhilling as it relates to ultra performance. And the reason I ask is I ran the Crested Butte Ultra in 2023, and I did a handful of downhill workouts prior to that. And I found that I had really, really, really strong climbing legs, and perhaps more importantly, an ability to fly downhill on these long and consistent downhills out in Crested Butte. And I felt amazing for 6 hours. It felt amazing for 5 hours, and the last hour I felt appropriately so. Talk to me about the repeated bout effect and how someone who's listening to this who might be looking to tweak some things in their training in 2025, how would they think about this concept? And first, what is this concept?
I'm going to make it even higher level than that and talk about specificity. So if you're training for a flat road race, you're not going to have as much in the way of big uphills, big downhills, but you always want to have variety in your training. So even someone training for like a track race is going to do some degree of hills. I remember the one who's in charge of the Olympic Committee at the moment. He's the world record holder in the half mile and 1500, I think, as well. Sebco. Yeah.
Yes.
So he would do a lot of hill work, even though he's training for a flat race. So there's still benefits to doing that. It gives you more strength, especially for the kick at the end, etc. If you're training for a more mountainous race, then of course you've got to get hills in there. And that's going to be a specific part of the training. The more mountainous it is, the more you need to be able to get that type of terrain, which can be a lot of difficulty for many people if they don't have that on their doorstep, like you do in Boulder or I do in Bend. But the main thing with the strength for the downhills is you don't need a huge amount of downhill running for that. So in terms of getting your legs prepared for dealing with a lot of downhill running, maybe it's a longer ultra, so there's just more accumulated uphill and downhill. Maybe it's lots of steep downhills. You don't need to do a huge amount. So like I said, for this downhill road race, I only did 3 sessions that were focused on downhilling spread over about a month. And they weren't all out. They weren't massively hard, but they were fairly tough. It wasn't a case of trying to destroy myself, but I definitely felt it the next day. But that is what we found in the science, that your legs actually adapt quite quickly to purely the strength element of downhill running. There's also the technical element. So if you're going to be on trails, you want to be able to pick the best line. You want to be able to brake to the minimum amount. There's also a lot of skill involved in coordination in terms of doing very fast, especially technical downhill. So if you watch someone like Killian flying downhill, it looks like he's gliding over the surface. And one of the key things there is that he's never in control of any footstep. Instead, he's got the ability to regain control. But once you're trying to be able to do particularly faster downhills, maybe that's not as applicable to a really long ultra, you've got to be able to go downhill on reasonably technical, say, single track, without ever worrying about, is this next foot that I plant 100% okay? It's okay if the gravel moves, if there's a little bit of a rock moving or it's a bit muddy, and you've got very fast feet to get onto the next step. So that comes from a lot more practice than just a few downhill attempts. And so to put it in context, I got my legs ready for a downhill road race with no technicality. I would have been horrendous on a downhill element in a trail race, which it seems like you'd have an overlap of at least the strength. But because you're having a very even kind of footstep on the road while on the trail, every footstep is different. You've got shorter strides, you've got changes of direction. It doesn't translate nearly as much. So if you're trying to get better at downhills, the simple thing is you've got to do more downhills. The more technical it is, the more you want to be pushing yourself to the limit of what you're comfortable with. So that doesn't mean run really fast for a 10-mile downhill. That means even just short bouts, maybe it's a minute or two, where you're just forcing yourself to get to the point where you feel uncomfortable. So on a really technical downhill, that may not be very fast, but maybe it's stopping yourself from braking as much or coming to a full stop. And just then forcing the coordination in your brain to get better at picking where your feet go. The better you get at that, the further you're looking ahead. So when I'm running down a mountain, like in something like Leadville, and I put in the months of training in the build up to that, added to the years of training that get you to that point, I'm looking kind of 20, 30 feet ahead. I don't look down once. I've kind of memorized where my next footsteps will be. And there's the flexibility of, well, okay, that moved, that wasn't quite what I expected. Quick footstep onto the next one. But you're looking ahead more to the line. This is the same with the driver. If you're driving fast around a track or someone's driving in dangerous conditions, you don't want to be looking right in front of you. You've got to be thinking, oh, there's a turn in the road or there's a traffic light coming up. And that's the stuff that allows you to predict things better while still having an awareness, of course, of what's around you. But it does take a lot more skill and a lot more practice to do a more technical downhill.
One of the most impressive things I've ever seen a runner do was when I was following Tim Olson at North Face, Massachusetts in, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, out at Wachusett Mountain. And so anyone who's listening who runs trails in the Northeast knows how technical those trails are. And these were, some really technical trails. And I had been running with Tim on flats and on a smooth trail. And then we switched to go downhill a little bit, and it became super technical. And he was gone like that. Like it was immediate. And he just glided down the trail, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. His hair was flowing in the wind. I was like, this is art. And so it's really impressive to see that skill at the highest level for sure.
But it's like any sport, you're not going to get better at basketball if you only do it once a week. You've got to be
Right.
doing regular training for it. It adds up over the years. You've got to be able to then practice the skill element. So when you're looking at downhills, there's the physical fitness, the leg strength, and the coordination there. But a lot of it is skill-based, especially for the really technical stuff. So a lot of the top Europeans tend to be skiers in winter. And so they're used to using poles on the downhill skiing, and they use poles on the downhill to allow themselves to be a little bit more, what's the word for this? So just to be able to keep a little bit more control while still being out of control. While a lot of the Americans wouldn't do that as much because we're not used to that kind of winter season of skiing in the same way. But it's really something that it's amazing how much better you can get if you can do it regularly.